what do you call a person who goes to like the, whatever, to a meeting with you if you don't speak the language, and they help you translate? What would you call that person?
I don't know, like a translator, right?
Yeah,
Like,
or an
or
interpreter.
interpreter. Okay,
Yeah,
yeah,
and so
yeah.
that's actually a word we use in English for someone who will help you understand what's going on in a situation where they're speaking another language. You would bring an interpreter, and I think that's like a really important thing to establish at the beginning, is that like what happens when you move from one language to another is it's interpreting what's said into a new context. And so like there is no objective translation. Like there's no such thing. and
Mm.
and I think that's one of those things that has become at least, if so people have known this for a very long time, and we've discussed, like, this has been discussed some within academic literature from the beginning, like of the modern academic period and when we start working with linguistics, is that the idea is that a symbol, like words are just symbols, right? They're symbols of ideas or whatever, and they have to be then transmitted, and then they have to be accepted and interpreted by the receiver. And so there is always, even in direct speech in the same language, we might have different ideas. And that's actually one of the things that I've been reading a little bit on recently, has been from the idea of cognitive science, that they're looking at this and thinking people, even speaking the same language, probably have different constructions in their head or different ideas of what words actually mean. And so individual differences within the same language, within the same community, are there. And so
Mm.
then as soon as you move to another language, or even another culture, right? So we know that there's probably things you say in Australian that I wouldn't necessarily understand what you meant, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and vice versa. And especially if we get down to things that we would say like colloquially in our local dialect or whatever, like there are going to be phrases that we would use that are uninterpretable for someone who isn't part of that context. And so that's one thing, right? There's a certain way you talk that is communicative, and you would choose also your register based on who you're talking to. So like all of these things play into this problem of what does language do, right? So language is meant to
Mm.
communicate, but you also choose the way you communicate based on who you're communicating with and all that kind of stuff. But when we translate, then there are different ways of thinking about it, and so when we're looking at something like Aramaic and Greek, they're very different structurally. Like the way the verbal systems work, the way the syntax works, the way everything works is just different. But that doesn't mean that we can't say things in another language. But it just means you have to sometimes pick different categories of what you want to say that aren't available in the other language. So when you talk about verbs, like Greek has a very intricate verb system, and the Semitic languages like Aramaic have a much simpler one. And so you're not forced to make the same decisions in Aramaic as you are in Greek. And and so that would lead you to probably, if you ask 10 people to translate something, they're going to say it in different ways. They're going to find different ways of saying it. And so that's, you're moving away from what was actually said, or the intention of it, especially if the person who's speaking Aramaic is speaking to an Aramaic audience, right?
Mm.
So one of the things, like, I'm functionally bilingual, living in Norway. I move throughout my day in Norwegian without any hesitation, and I don't think about whether I'm speaking Norwegian or English. But transitioning between the two can be a little bit difficult. But it really depends on my audience. And so if I'm speaking to Norwegians, I use a different register, and I speak differently than I would just talking to you, who's a native speaker, and especially differently than talking to my dad or someone from back home, who have a different register, a different dialect. And I've definitely gained like this international English uh, dialect or accent, because I'm so used to speaking to people that probably have some I don't know, prejudices against a guy that talks like that. Um,
when, when my little brother was
I'm
living,
exaggerating a
yeah,
little bit,
yeah,
but you know, it's like it's sometimes
we-
it does, and especially when I'm back home in Virginia, my register changes. Um, and so all that is to say, like, there are so many different factors that play into what happens when we're moving from one language to another that just make it so intricate that
mm,
we can never assume that what was said, you know, in say in Aramaic is exactly what's written there in Greek. And so this
mm.
idea of it being an exact representation is you know, it's ridiculous. And so but that for me doesn't matter really, because I think that what we're actually looking at when we're looking at the Gospels is is representations of traditions related to Jesus, not necessarily Jesus's exact words. And so I don't see why we would need to think that all of these things were only passed down in Aramaic up until the point when the gospel writer sits with that source and says, "Oh, now I'm going to make it Greek." Like
Mm.
I don't buy into like the Mark having been originally written in Aramaic completely and then translated to Greek. Um,
Is that like a theory that's out there?
well, it's been it's been proposed, it's been discussed in the literature, and I think it's pretty much. I mean, it's pretty much not accepted in mainstream scholarship
Mm,
that there's like an older Aramaic version, but there, there's stuff that clearly is Aramaic influence there, and so like we might have had a a group of Aramaic speakers that transmitted stuff, and then Greek speakers heard about it and transmitted it too, and whether that was oral or written or whatever, it doesn't really matter, because when you experience something, you talk about it, and even just the telling of a story is in a way translating it into a new context. And so like the
mm,
telling of something that happened or something that was said in the context of hanging out with your friends, or talking to your parents, or sitting in a synagogue or whatever is different, right? And so you're going to tell it
mm.
in a different way. Like, I mean, if something something that happens to me all the time is I'll find myself in a situation where I've told a story, and like maybe I'll tell it in private. I'll tell it and I'll be like really animated and like maybe curse a little bit, throw in all that kind of stuff. But then I'll start to tell this story in a situation where I realize I can't tell it like that. Like
Yeah,
you at
yeah,
work, or there'll be another person that enters the room, or whatever, and you're just going to be like, and I
yeah,
was yeah, so then I was surprised at and
yeah,
you
yeah,
change
yeah.
the language, you change your mannerisms, you do all that kind of stuff, and so I think it's very very likely that what happens when these stories are transmitted over time, that they're just adapted to different contexts, right? And so when we're like, if we're trying to get back to the words that Jesus said, I find it really really difficult when we're sitting there with a Greek Bible, because it's going to be, no matter what, it's going to be somebody's interpretation of that, and that
Mm,
interpretation is going to be just as reliant on the structures of language, the ideas, the vocabulary that person has, both the initial receiver of it or the initial translator of it, whatever. Like all of those things are going to rely on so much on what's going on inside the heads of the person or people there, that it's just, yeah, it's just silly to go around and argue about whether it was exactly this that was said.
mm,
Like, and I think like one of the things is, even the Lord's Prayer, right, shows up in Luke and in Matthew, and it's slightly different. And that's like, for me, is a really great example of it. That I mean, yeah, sure, probably there was like there was this prayer that was associated with Jesus, and it was had these basic structures, but it probably wasn't said exactly the same every time. Maybe it was said exactly the same every time, but people didn't hear it the same every time because they didn't reproduce it the same.